First though, how blind people are portrayed on TV, in films and books has been a long-running debate. You hear rather less about our appearance in TV ads, which could be quite an omission considering the number of times people see an ad and the lasting impression it's designed to make. Just recently though, they have become, by previous standards, all the rage. There was the Nokia ad which featured visually impaired photographer Gary Waite, who we spoke to on the programme. And then there was this ad made for a betting company. Here it is, specially audio described by In Touch.
Two teams of blind footballers compete for possession of a ball with a bell. A cat called Tiddles enters the field of play. The players mistake the sound of Tiddles' collar for the rattle of the ball. A player pulls his foot back and prepares to shoot.
Paddy Power can't get Tiddles back. There's nothing we can do about that.
And we'd like to stress that no visually impaired people or cats or audio describers were injured in the making of our interpretation of that ad. It was, in fact, the third most complained about ad of all time, according to the Advertising Standards Agency, almost all objections showing concern about the fate of the cat. But what lies behind this increased visibility and what messages are the ads designed to give? The latest example is for Dove beauty products.
It's like the feeling of the sun on my skin or the wind in my hair.
I feel like laughing and dancing.
I feel beautiful. It makes me happy.
And I want it to stay that way because I want to feel like that every day. Being blind, I can't physically see the colour of my hair. I don't need to see it, I can feel it.
Well, we'll hear from the woman who took part in that ad in a moment. But first, I asked the ad's creative director, Sarah Bamford, what was the idea behind it?
The idea initially came from the briefing that we had with Dove, where there was a colour psychologist present, as well as two people having their hair coloured during the session. What was really interesting when we listened to the colour psychologist, she was actually talking about a test when you are blindfolded and you hold your hands over different colour shades. You can generally feel if they're cool or warm colours, which we found really interesting.
So, I mean, I can see that, and people have long debated this whole idea of texture and colour, but I mean, why did that have to be a visually impaired person to make the ad work?
As someone myself who actually, colours my hair, I know that it gives you a real emotional uplift. You feel kind of more positive, you want to go out. And it also physically changes the texture of your hair. So technically, the pigment in the colour plumps out the strands of hair, so it feels silkier and softer and smoother. And we thought blind people see the world through their sensations and rely on feelings rather than just sight. So who better a spokesperson to talk about the feeling of colour than a blind person?
But of course, people watching don't know, do they, until very near the end of that advert, when she actually says that she's visually impaired or that she's blind, that she is. So what's that supposed to do to their desire to buy your hair products?
We never wanted to cheat the viewer or try and hide the fact that Kate was blind through the ad. We didn't want it to be this big, kind of clanger at the end that we would drop. And we wanted people to see the ad for the second time and to actually see that Kate is blind and that we hadn't hid it from the viewer during the ad. We didn't want to focus on Kate and the fact that she was blind. We wanted to really celebrate the feeling of colour.
So in a way, you want to have your cake and eat it. You don't want to make a big thing of it, but you do want people to realise sooner or later.
Well, we wanted Kate to reveal in the most kind of true and authentic way, and how she would if she was to meet somebody and tell them that she was blind. And this was how, we discussed at length with Kate how she would do that, and that was the response that she gave. She speaks very matter of fact that she's blind, and that's what we included in the TVC at the end.
I have to say just one thing, as a totally blind person, of course I didn't know what it was advertising, because there isn't any indication. Isn't there something of an irony there that you're using a visually impaired subject, but actually a blind person wouldn't know what the advert was about?
There is a version which talks about Dove Colour Care Radiance, colour that you can feel, and about keeping the colour, keep the feelings.
So there is a version with the name of the company and what it's about in it?
Yes, there is, yes.
Sarah Bamford. So how did it look and feel from the other end of the camera? Kate Crofts explained how she got the gig.
Initially, the casting
just specified that it was looking for a blind woman, an age range that I was very much towards the top of, might I add, and that she should have healthy hair, perhaps have coloured her hair, and it stated what the product was for. But actually, fundamentally, from having watched my own casting video back fairly recently, I think it's how I talk about colour and talk about hair that probably got me the job more, perhaps, than how I look and my physical description.
So given that portrayal is quite a big issue amongst visually impaired people, are you happy with how you were portrayed and what it portrayed?
Very happy. There's one skirt that I was put in the advert that I'm not so happy with. But other than that, I'm delighted with the ad. The whole ad is very me. The reactions have been from people, well, we're really delighted that you haven't been sort of over airbrushed or had scripted or given something that's not true to my character. The advert is very much reflective of who I am, what I believe. The words are my words and the look is my look, largely.
One of the things that we have had commented on is the fact that right at the end of the advert you mentioned that you're visually impaired, but it isn't obvious in any way, and some people have said there just aren't many visually impaired people who you wouldn't have a clue unless it was shot in a very particular way.
Well, there's two ways I can reflect on that. One, if you do freeze frame through it and you're somebody who knows about visual impairment, you can spot that I'm visually impaired before the reveal, but you'd need to know what you're looking for. So yes, there's not any of the really overt identifiers in that most of the shots used, I gather, are when my eyes are pointing to camera, but I can't control my eyes to point to camera, guaranteed. So that was the way it's been edited, perhaps, that those shots were used. But there's no shots with my dog or a cane visible. However, there are shots where I am walking and trailing a hand going through a doorway. So somebody who knew about visually impaired people doing that when they're not using a mobility aid would spot that. To the informed, there are cues that I'm blind.
How do you feel about the reveal, the fact that it is revealed right at the end?
I didn't know that was going to be part of the process until perhaps 2/3 of the way through the scripting and the discussion. When I first learnt it, I did think about it, but actually I understand why it's there. It's to generate an emotional response to the rest of the advert. And fundamentally, the advert isn't advertising blindness. It's advertising a product that's all about colour. So the advert should start being about colour and beauty and move into blindness second, because the blindness is just one of the vehicles they're using to describe the colour and the realness of me as a beautiful woman.
Let me bring in Dr David Bolt, who's Director of the Centre for Culture and Disability Studies at Liverpool Hope University. First of all, David, are we seeing more representation of visually impaired people?
It's worth saying that this is not the first Dove advert that has used someone who has a visual impairment. I mean, I'm aware of 3, including this one. And I would say even within those 3, this is the more progressive of the 3. So I think, that's a positive shift. And also the fact that these adverts use women who have visual impairments. I mean, in the past, it would be generally men, as it were. And that's a fact in relation to cultural representations in general. Historically, representations have been based on charity, on the idea of almost a parasitic person in relation to society. Whereas now, as you've been talking there, it's clear that in this instance, a visually impaired person is put forward as an example.
So why are we now being seen as good for selling rather than good for a bit of legalised begging, as you might say as for some of the charity adverts that people get used for?
Yeah, well, I mean, I would like to say that that's a shift in the positive direction of diversity in general. I mean, that certainly would be my, my hope and wish. But, I try not to be too cynical here. It is tricky to say whether this is, at some level of box-ticking exercise. I think the key thing is, for me, is when I first heard about this advert is, first question, is Kate visually impaired herself? Yes, she is. So great. That's a definite step in the right direction, as it were. Let
me come back to Kate. Again, amongst some of the comments, there have been comments on Facebook and Twitter and so forth. Some people still saying, there's an element of exploitation in this. Were you exploited or just paid to do a job?
No. If I had felt for a moment exploited, and as I would in any other walk of my life, I wouldn't have done it.
How much say did you actually have in how it was put together? Yeah.
Oh, an enormous amount. I wouldn't envisage for a moment that anyone who conceived as the advert at the beginning really had very close to a final image of what it now looks like in their mind, because the advert is so very based upon me, my life, and the scripting that the director and I came up with by talking to each other by Skype and phone before we went out to record it. So,
David Bolt, just finally, companies that use visual impairment, they'll always walk the tightrope of disapproval, won't they?
Yeah, I absolutely, and that's why I would say that there are pros and cons to this advert. And the big pro for me is the fact that Kate has visual impairment. I also have the kind of major concern, perhaps, that this is an advert about colour, and it talks about the means of perception in those terms. Whereas I think any means of perception, even those that aren't visual, are perfectly legitimate and can be celebrated without being framed in a visual context.
But David, that's precisely what I do in the advert. I
Yeah,
am
absolutely.
very acutely aware of the synesthesia phenomenon of enjoying and experiencing one sense through another. And if you listen closely to the lyric in the advert, that's precisely what I'm saying. To me, yellowness is a sense of lemon in my drink or sun on my face, and that's how I feel it. So that's
Absolutely.
my words, so it's an opinion. You can't argue with my opinion.
Well, whether I can argue with it or not is another matter.
You can argue
but
with it as a truth. You can't argue with it as a view. It's my
Absolutely.
perception, and the advert is describing me as a real woman who is beautiful and experiences colour and describes it that way.
Well,
Yeah, and certainly I wouldn't put forward anything that I say as a particular truth, but I would say that I also have an opinion, and that's that my means of perception is different from yours, but also easily expressed without visual terms, although the temptation is always there.
Well, the delight of this issue is that it raises all sorts of things we can talk about on the programme. We'd welcome your views. Dr. David Bolt, Kate Crofts, thank you both very much indeed.